Hello, and welcome to Crocheting with the Classics. Today we're going to talk about what sorts of items you might actually need to start crocheting versus what sort of items you might just want or people might try to sell you. So, first off, let's start with the obvious. You're going to need yarn. Any type of yarn. I feel like that's a duh one. You're also going to need a crochet hook of one sort or another. Something that fits the yarn. In this case, that would be this hook. So, yarn, hooks, absolute necessities. Now here's where you can get a little controversial. I would argue that you also need stitch markers. Now, if all you wanted to do was mark a particular stitch up one row to the next, if you were going in circles or so on, then you don't need these. You can take another piece of different colored yarn, weave it through the stitch, and just keep weaving it up the stitch as you go. No problem. But if you're having to assemble something and work through double rows, you are going to need stitch markers, because those will hold your thing in shape. For instance, I had to use stitch markers on this bag. Here, 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 and here, so that I could work through both rows and hold the bag in shape. I couldn't have done that with a piece of yarn very well. It's just a lot easier doing it with stitch markers. Now, the other thing I would argue that you actually need versus want are yarn needles. Now, you notice I've got mine in a little jar thing. So, with the yarn needles, the reason these are a need instead of a want is because you get a lot more precise and even blending in of the stitches and the loose ends with a yarn needle than you do with a hook, because the hook pulls on the yarn more. So if you look at this, even I can't tell where the end of this thing is, because it's woven in and I used a yarn needle. Now, as far as necessities go, you could go into basically any craft store, anywhere you wanted, and you could find a little pack of crochet hooks in aluminum, the stitch markers, and the yarn needles, probably about $10. Or you could go on Amazon and you could get one of their starter packs that has all of that in there too, and it's still about $10. So that's about $10 for all the tools besides yarn that you need. And as to yarn, in a future video we're going to get into where you can find cheap yarn. So, to that end, continuing on with things you might want. So, first off, if you start looking at crochet stuff, you're going to see yarn bowls. Now, this is one my sister got me as a present. Isn't it pretty? Do you actually need it? Nope, you do not. But if you happen to get annoyed because your yarn's flopping all over the place as you use it, this helps. I will say, however, and apologies to my sister, I don't use this nearly as much as I use this. So this, see how it spins? This is a lovely little yarn holder that you can set your yarn cake in. And as you pull on it, It spins it for you. It is so handy. But it was also, gosh, I think like 50 bucks. So this is not a need, this is a want. You do not need this. If you have more patience than I do, just do it by hand and live with it. But if you have a little extra money, highly recommend these. So useful. Alright, another thing in the realm of wants. Yarn hook holder. So you notice this one looks handmade, and it is, because you can get patterns for these on Etsy or other places, and it can hold all your stuff. You notice I've got needles, I've got stitch markers, I've got a little pair of scissors that I can find anything in, and I have all my little ergonomic hooks, all of them in there. And in here I've got another, this is just a want, this is a little stitch marker counter. Goes on your finger, you press buttons as you go, marks the stitches. So honestly, for people who aren't absent-minded, this would be very useful. I have found I am very absent-minded. I forget to press the little button. So, not so useful for me. There are models that do it based on your hand movements, but that's not one of those. And again, those are just wants. Those are not needs. Now, if we get into the really fancy wants... Oh, before we get into the really fancy wants, let me just add yarn bags to carry your projects in. You'll probably see a bunch of expensive ones, and honestly, you don't need those either. You can do just as well with one of those cheap little free tote bags, or alternately. So one of the things that I've found when riding around in a car, like if you're going to see Christmas lights or something, and done perfectly fine with a gallon Ziploc bag with the yarn in it and the hook in it and my stitch markers and my little thing. And it was great. Worked perfectly, kept the yarn clean, kept me out of mischief. So you don't really need the fancy yarn bags, but you might want one. All right, now, fancy realm. First off, this is a yarn cake winder. It's a nice heavy duty one. And what it does is it takes skeins of yarn like this one, and it turns them into yarn cakes like this, where you can do a center pull and it's much easier to get the yarn out. Now, can you get the yarn out of this anyway without doing that? Yeah, absolutely. It just takes a bit of doing. So, not a need, definitely a want. Also, there's a little light. Sometimes if you're trying to see a particularly tiny stitch, a little extra light can help. This is a little clip-on light I've got. And it just allows me to adjust where the light's coming from. But you could do the same thing with a lamp. Any sort of lamp you got. So, again, not a need, more of a want. There's also something called a yarn swifter. Now, I don't have one of those. But have you ever seen the grannies holding the yarn between their hands, going do-do-do-do-do over their hands, holding it apart? Basically, that's what a yarn swifter does. Holds apart the yarn so that it's easier to get it onto that. So you switch the yarn, then it goes on there. Personally, I just think it's funny if you do it that way without it, and the yarn flops around on the floor like a little fish, and it's adorable. Especially if your chihuahua's after it. Okay, so that's pretty much everything I can think of. But just remember, you can start crocheting probably for less than $10 actually, if you find sales. Anyway, y'all have a lovely afternoon, and thanks for being with me. Goodbye.